Archaic Records.
Hey, what's up, everybody? It's Archaic Records here with you again. My name is Jamie, coming at you from Nashville, Tennessee. Here to wish you a very happy Morrissey Monday, a weekly celebration of all things Morrissey and the Smiths. And for this week's episode, we're going to go back to 1983 as the band, the Smiths, begin work on what would eventually become their 1984 self-titled debut record. A record that, if you ask me, despite the fact that of the 4 studio albums put out by the Smiths, it is their weakest, to me, this is the greatest debut album of all time. Now, you may be asking yourself, how can an album, which is the weakest of its own catalog, still be the greatest debut album of all time? I just don't understand what you're saying. Well, to find the answer to your question, my friends, what I suggest you do is go back and listen to the Smiths. It's relatively self-explanatory if you do. But in 1983, the band were in hunt for a producer, somebody who could take this lump of clay and mold it into something that would be memorable. And to fill the position of producer on the first Smiths record, originally the band decided on a young man named Troy Tate, somebody who had made a name for himself in Britain as a member of bands like The Teardrop Explodes, a band which I absolutely love, by the way. He was also a member of a band called Fashion. Now, that is a band that I don't know as much about as I do Teardrop Explodes, which I love. But as the band began working with Troy Tate and trying to put together their 1984 self-titled debut album, as the record neared completion, all 4 members of the band were very dissatisfied with the product as it was, and decided to sack Troy Tate and begin the process all over again, re-recording the record with John Porter. Now, if you go back and you listen to the Troy Tate recordings, tapes, sessions, however you want to put it, moving away from those recordings, to me at least as a fan, seems like an obvious decision. I've always pictured the band sitting around in the studio listening to these recordings as this record was nearing completion. And they must have been completely disappointed by the outcome. Of course, John Porter comes in, the band starts the whole process over again. You imagine them feeling re-energized, reinvigorated. And of course, as I mentioned before, the final project comes out in February of 1984, and it is at least in my opinion, the greatest debut album of all time. I mean, hands down. Now, as far as the Troy Tate recordings and the demos and a lot of the work that was being done during the initial recording process for the 1984 self-titled debut album, those tracks have never been officially released. Most of those tracks have never been officially released. But through the miracle of bootleg, of course, these have seen the light of day. Of course, this is one that I just picked up last year. I think that this came out last year, this particular pressing. Now, I like the artwork on this because whoever put this bootleg together, they sort of stayed true to the sort of Smiths aesthetic as far as the album artwork goes. And of course, there's a pretty cool picture, very well-known picture of the band on the back. Now, one thing that I love about the fact that these are, out there and, you can go back and listen to them. Not that I really go back and listen to the Tate recordings very often, because they are not necessarily the band at their best, especially when it does come to the production. But I love the fact that these are available as historical documents, as archive pieces, and really as a big part of the story of, the debut album. Now, the Troy Tate recordings that are released on this particular bootleg, now this was planned to be the original album. That does not mean that this album contains the entire Troy Tate working tapes. A lot of those tapes can be found, though, online if you are so interested in going back and checking them out. But if you go back and you listen to this record, which apparently this was planned to be the first debut album, not the artwork, but I'm talking about the songs that are on this record. And as they stand on this record, like I said, you can't imagine this being released as the band's debut album, especially compared to the final product that would eventually come out in 1984. I mean, the production on this record is just putrid. Even a lot of the band's performances on this record are sloppy. They are uninspired. Morrissey himself, although his voice technically sounds great on a lot of these songs, he sounds out of sync. He sounds disinterested, and perhaps this is reading into the situation because, of course, we know how these sessions turn out. But you get the sense, you can really sort of feel in the music that there's frustration within the band. I feel like they know that they are not playing up to their potential. And like I said, there's a lot of these songs where Morrissey himself in particular, though his voice technically sounds good, and I love Morrissey's vocals on the 1984 self-titled debut album. Of course, it isn't, Morrissey's voice, I think, kind of like got better and better as the Smiths went along. You go back and you listen to the 1984 self-titled debut album. At this point in time, it sort of makes me laugh how young Morrissey sounds. Of course, he was very young back in those days. But technically his voice on the Troy Tate tapes sounds okay, but he is just like completely disinterested. And a lot of the songs on this record, to me, they just sound like a big bowl of like soup. There's very little distinguishability in the songs. There's no like cleanliness. One of the things I love most about the Smiths in terms of their music and Morrissey's solo catalog, for that matter, is I love how crisp and clean it is. I love that you can hear all of the individual pieces within each song. I'm somebody who really loves sort of neat, clean lines. I think that's one reason why I've always said, just to use him as an example, that's one reason why I've always said that Mike Joyce is my favorite drummer of all time. Spencer Coburn probably being my second favorite drummer of all time. And you could probably make the argument that Spencer Coburn is technically a better drummer than Mike Joyce. In fact, I don't even know that is an argument, really. But Mike Joyce has always been my favorite drummer because what he does isn't necessarily fancy, but it's clean, it's efficient, it's pretty simple, and that's what I like. I like a clean, simple backbeat. I like really clean lines. As I've mentioned before on this channel, sometimes I get real tired of people hand-jobbing, people like Neil Peart and, Mike Portnoy and John Bonham and all those guys. And they're fine. They're great. I mean, Neil Peart is great if you're a nerd and you're into all of the, super technicalities of his band. But for me, I would take Mike Joyce on my team every single day. Now, that's just one example of what I'm talking about. Another thing about this record, these tapes that really I find to be incredibly disappointing, is what he did with Johnny Marr. I mean, Johnny Marr is, like I said, all of the songs are just this sort of sludge. There's no cleanliness. There's no definition to any of the songs. And Johnny Marr is just kind of hidden in this sort of muck. I have no idea what he was thinking in terms of how he produced the music instrumentally. And I mean, how do you, for one thing, Johnny Marr is the greatest guitar player of all time, at least in my opinion. I mean, how do you bury him? How do you make him sound boring, if not almost bad in some points of this song? So if you go back and you think about this record, especially, if these tapes were supposed to be the first record, which is what I'm led to believe, you can't even really wrap your mind around this being the first record, especially compared to how unbelievable the 1984 self-titled debut record is. The first song off this record, much like the 1984 finished product, is Reel Around the Fountain. To me, the Troy Tate tape version of it is it's much slower than the finished version. Again, the band sounds a little bit loose, but individually on this song, I think if you really try to sit down and like listen in, I think all of the individual pieces, when you can pick them out, they all sound okay. This song sounds semi recognizable to the John Porter finished product, although it is a little bit sloppy. Morrissey's performance in this song is much less dynamic than what would appear on the finished album. His voice itself, I think, actually sounds really flawless on the Tate tape, but he is just a little bit lifeless. Like I said, that's one of the complaints I have throughout the Troy Tate sessions, is that Morrissey himself at times sounds to be disinterested, frustrated, not happy with the proceedings. And of course, like I said, it's easy to read into that because, we know what eventually happened with this project. The whole thing was scrapped. Now, Reel Around the Fountain is a song that I absolutely love on the 1984 self-titled debut. My one complaint I've always had about Reel Around the Fountain isn't the song itself. It is where the song is on the album. As a side one, track one, I don't love Reel Around the Fountain. I tend to like records that kind of jump out of the gate with a little bit more tempo. I've always thought that if you switched the first two songs, You've Got Everything Now and Reel Around the Fountain, I think the album starts off better. I love both those songs. I love Reel Around the Fountain as a song. This version of it, though, is, I would say, although it is one of the better versions on the Troy Tate sessions, it is definitely sloppy. It's a little bit under tempo, honestly. I mean, like I said, the finished Reel Around the Fountain is pretty down tempo, but this one's almost like under tempo. Like I said, Morrissey, his voice technically sounds good, but you could tell something just isn't clicking with him. The second song on this record, like the finished product, is You've Got Everything Now. The first thing that strikes me about this version of this song is the sloppiness of the band. I mean, again, this song is semi-up-tempo, especially compared to Reel Around the Fountain, and this version of it, the band jumps right in, and it's just slop. You can't make heads or tails of half of what the band's doing. It is like a jumble. This version is much inferior to the finished product. Probably much more inferior than the Reel Around the Fountain is. The production is super muddy, like I said. Again, Morrissey's voice technically sounds good on this. But again, he sounds frustrated. He sounds disinterested. He's almost out of sync with the music a little bit. You've Got Everything Now is such a great song, especially on the finished product. Like I just said, sometimes I wish that this was the side one, track one of the song. It's one of my favorite songs off of the 1984 debut album. But the Troy Tate session of it is one of the weaker moments on this song, because one thing I love about the finished version of Reel Around the Fountain You've Got Everything Now, is that, yeah, it's up-tempo, but it's really, and like I said before, it's clean, it's defined, it's got it's got distinct lines, whereas this one is just it's like you took a spoonful of gravy and just slapped it onto a plate. There's no definition. It's just a sort of blob of sound. And again, where's Johnny Marr? How do you mute Johnny Marr? How do you make Johnny Marr sound uninteresting? It's almost like a miracle of production. That's one thing I come back to when I listen to these early tapes, is this is almost as if it was done on purpose. This is so bad production-wise that you can't help but think that it was almost some sort of a joke, or maybe he was trying to make some sort of avant-garde statement with his production style. But the You've Got Everything Now on the Tate tapes is just a bummer, in my opinion. The third song on this record, much like the finished product, is Miserable Lie. Again, very sloppy, very muddy, very dull. Again, one thing I love about the Smiths, I've said it before, is their sharpness. This song has no definition. This song sounds like just a bowl of gumbo. There's no way you can discern or define anything that's going out or that's going on. And Morrissey's voice on this song in particular, not only does he sound disinterested and off time, but he sounds completely out of whack. It doesn't even really sound even like youthful Morrissey. This is not a good version of this song. And of course, this song is notorious for, the last half of it having these just, insane falsetto gymnastics, which Morrissey performs on this song as well. That's, even on the original version or the finished version of this song on the 1984 self-titled debut, this is my least favorite song, easily, on the finished product because of the second half of the song. The first half of the song I like, but when Morrissey goes into those falsetto gymnastics to me, and I love your voice, Steve, I love it, man, I love it, but it's a little bit much on the song Miserable Lie, and I've always told people, if you don't like Morrissey's voice, or if for some reason his voice doesn't really agree with you, I disagree with that, but if you need evidence to sort of back up where you're coming from, listen to the second half of Miserable Lie, because it is a little bit cringe, at least in my opinion, even for the biggest Morrissey fan. This is one of those songs, again, I could live without the second half of this song. But that's one thing about this song is I imagine this song is so produced so poorly and it's played, not very well either. And that's one thing I will say as well, in fairness to Troy Tate, who I think completely dropped the ball on this project. But some of the performances by the band during these sessions, weren't exactly home runs either. And this is definitely one of those cases. This doesn't even really sound like the song. And if there was ever even a hint that this, or an idea, I should say, that this version of this song was going to reach the marketplace, I mean, that is pretty rough, in my opinion. The next song after that, much like the finished product, is the song Pretty Girls Make Graves. This one is actually a little bit better. Actually, of the songs on the Tate tapes, Pretty Girls Make Graves is actually one of the better ones. This one isn't too far off, actually, from the finished album version. It does sound, if you compare it to the 1984 self-titled debut version, it is a little bit, shallow. It's a little bit empty. I don't love the production on it, but it's not as egregious as some of the other parts of the record. And this one, I mentioned before on the song Miserable Lie, the band just isn't together. It's just not a very good performance by the band. This version of this song is performed pretty well. Morrissey sounds okay, although I would say that, he is on time and he sounds a little bit more interested and less frustrated, at least, with what's going on in this song. But the production on his voice in particular is really tinny. It sounds really sort of shallow and superficial. I don't know what they were met with. They were trying to do something different with his voice. I'm not a musician. I've said that before. I don't really know anything about studio tricks, but there's something off about Morrissey's voice, although, like I said, his performance sounds okay, and he's on time, and the band seem to be, playing the song pretty well. Overall, I would say that Pretty Girls Make Graves, as far as the Tate tapes go, is probably one of the better tracks on this recording. It's not terrible. It's certainly inferior to what would eventually become the finished product, at least in my opinion. The next song after that ends side one as far as the Tate sessions go, and that is The Hand That Rocks the Cradle. That's also the next song, of course, on the finished product. I mean, this version of this song is almost completely unrecognizable compared to the finished version. It is so sloppy. It sounds just so empty and shallow. And it's funny, the funniest part, or what strikes me the most about this particular version of it, is Morrissey's vocal delivery on this song. Now, Morrissey at times has been described as somebody who's hard to work with. And I think, of course, people always have complained that Morrissey is too much of a perfectionist, that the band, the Smiths, were too much of a perfectionist. They knew what they wanted. They were uncompromising. And that's one of the things, I think, if you go back and you check out these Troy Tate sessions, I think it served the band well, because if you go back and you're in the studio, and if this is the finished or near to the finished product of this first record, you have to be just dying on the inside, knowing how good these songs are, but knowing how terrible they sound. And I get the impression that by this point in the recording, Morrissey is just done with this whole situation, because if you go back and you listen to Morrissey's delivery on The Hand That Rocks the Cradle, he sounds like an awkward teenager that is reciting a poem that he just despises in like his high school language arts class. He could not possibly be less interested in what is going on in this song. This song is just painful. And this is a song that I love. I love the song Hand That Rocks the Cradle. But this is one of the worst versions of this song, any of the songs on the Troy Tate sessions. It is painfully boring. It is empty. It's shallow. It has no warmth. You can't distinct anything musically that's going on. And again, when you've got players like Mike Joyce and Johnny Marr in particular, two people that I think are as good at their craft as anybody. And again, Mike Joyce, who I love, giving you a nice, clean, solid backbeat. How does it turn into this? How do the Smiths end up sounding like this? Now, again, their performance on this particular tune isn't them at their best, but the production on this song is, again, I said it before, it's almost as if he's sabotaging the band. If he thinks that this is his sort of, weird, interesting signature on his production style, it sucks, man. I don't know what else to tell you. This sounds terrible. And I almost wonder at certain points, as you're listening to this recording, of course it was the band that vetoed these recordings, thankfully, at the end of the day. But if this record gets past the band, and this record is presented in this form to the record company, I almost wonder if at that point it doesn't get sent back down. Like, no, we're not releasing this. I don't even know what this is, because this is just crap right here. And this version of Hand That Rocks the Cradle is insulting. It's insulting to a song that is so good and so well written, and one of my favorite songs off of the 1984 debut. I don't know what is even going on in this song. The next song after that starts off side 2 of the Tate sessions, and that is Hand in Glove. This song is very up-tempo, of course. Now, the one thing that strikes you at the beginning of this song, at least me, in the Tate version, I actually sort of would take over the finished 1984 version, is that there is no harmonica at the beginning. Now, at the very end of the song, there is sort of a spacey, understated harmonica that kind of floats through the end of the song, which I actually like. I will give a lot of credit for the way that they use the harmonica at the end of this song. And now, I've mentioned this on this channel before. When I talk about this song in particular, Hand in Glove, which of course is a very historically significant song in the history of the Smiths, I would kill to have, and it's probably attainable. It's not anything I would have to go out and rob a bank for, but I don't have a copy of the original pressing of this single, which is something I should go out and, pick up, secure a copy at some point in time. But the harmonica in this song is something that I could just always sort of live without. I'm sort of a weird dude when it comes to the harmonica. It's not necessarily my favorite thing in the world. I'm real finicky when it comes to anything with a harmonica. So the fact that the harmonica isn't really in this version at the beginning, I actually think is, better. I don't think that this version, I don't think that this version of this song is bad. Now, to me, it doesn't really sound like a studio recording. To me, this actually sounds like a pretty decent live recording. If this recording were on a live record, I would accept it as being pretty good, but the production is messy. There's no definition to the song at all. Although I will argue that Morrissey does sound pretty good on it. His voice sounds great. And the production on his voice isn't that bad. And again, I kind of like the effect at the end where they sort of had this sort of spacey, subtle, understated harmonica kind of floating floating the tail end of the song. I kind of like how they use it there. So I would argue that as far as the Tate tapes go, Hand in Glove is one of the better recordings. Like I said, I don't think it's necessarily up to Smith's standard at all, and it's not necessarily something that would sound great on a studio album. But if it were on, a live album, I think it's a pretty decent version of it. The next song after that is What Difference Does It Make? Whew, man, they really dropped it on this one. For one thing, one of my favorite things about What Difference Does It Make is the guitar solo at the beginning. And I don't know what they did to it, but it's basically completely muted. It's not played very well, quite frankly, honestly, either, which is surprising. But throughout this whole song, the guitar just sounds terrible. It's completely buried in the mix. It's not particularly played super well, but my question is this, and I asked this before, how do you make Johnny Marr sound bad? I mean, this is really like a miracle of engineering. This is like the Hoover Dam. I mean, how do you make Johnny Marr not sound like the greatest guitar player of all time? Apparently, you hire Troy Tate to produce your first record, because one of my favorite things about What Difference Does It Make is the guitar. I love the guitar that goes through the entire song. It starts at the very beginning of the song, and it's just putrid on this recording. This recording, again, I say it again, it's messy. There's no definition. There's no clean lines. Morrissey's performance is okay. Again, I get the sense that he is not necessarily overly stoked about what's going on in the studio during these sessions. His voice sounds good technically, but again, just completely disinterested and kind of like, not really perfectly on time, kind of following his own melody a little bit. It's very disappointing. I mean, by the time you get to this point of the record, which you're now into the second song on side 2, nothing should really disappoint you. But What Difference Does It Make is one of my favorite songs on the finished record, and this production of it just stinks. And again, the band on this one, in fairness, their performance isn't necessarily the highlight of it either. After that is the song I Don't Owe You Anything. I mean, wow. That's all I can say. First off, before you even get into the production on I Don't Owe You Anything, instrumentally, this song just sounds like a giant bag of ass. The band's performance on this record, on this track, is not good. The guitar sounds like, at the beginning of the song, it has that sort of guitar that hits, and the production of it is just terrible. It literally sounds like two kids are sword fighting with aluminum ball bats. There's a clank every time he hits that note on the guitar that literally makes your teeth hurt. I mean, this song is a mess, start to finish. If there's any chance that this song was ever going to reach the marketplace, this would have been an embarrassment to the band and to Troy Tate, as far as I'm concerned, because this is such a great song. Again, what are you doing with these songs that are so great? After you get through the intro of the guitar part, where it like I said, it sounds like this, like you're hitting two pieces of aluminum together. Once you get into the actual song then, and the actual guitar rhythm after the intro, Johnny Marr's guitar sounds like it's being played on a warped record. I have no idea what's going on. Morrissey almost sounds like he's crying at this point in time on this recording. He just sounds miserable. He sounds like he would rather be literally working for the city sanitation service than participating in these recording sessions. This is just an absolute mess of a song. There's no definition. It's just soupy, shallow. How do you make it soupy and shallow, by the way? Also, I'd like to know the answer to that question. The guitar intro sucks, and the instrumentation sucks, and of course, like I said, Johnny Marr's guitar playing throughout the song, it sounds like it's slowed down, and then it sounds like it's playing on a tape that got left out in the sun. And again, a song I really love. I love the song on the record. I Don't Owe You Anything. But this version of it is like an abomination. After that is the song Suffer the Little Children. How can... I wrote, how can a song sound so sad and shallow at the same time? This song is just, again, with the production, it is just so muddy, undefined. This song has no energy at all. This song literally just sits there. And this is where I picture the band really sitting around the studio, and maybe they send Troy Tate off for a coffee and maybe a pack of cigarettes, and they really have to have a huddle and say, this is not working out, because this is one of the most dark and beautifully written songs in the early days of the band. And how do you go about making this song sound so empty and chintzy and soulless and muddy? And again, I can't help but ask the question, is this like sabotage? Was there some sort of a jealousy issue with Troy Tate and the band? Because the band's Teardrop Explodes, the band that Troy Tate was in that I love, they just weren't as good as the Smiths. They didn't have the talent of the Smiths. They didn't have the musicianship or the songwriting. Was it jealousy? Was it sabotage? Did somebody put him up to this? Did somebody pay him to burn down these sessions? Because this song, Suffer Little Children, it's almost as if it's done deliberately. I can't even state that enough. I feel like there's something that just isn't right. So I picture the band as they're sitting around listening to Suffer Little Children, which to me is probably, if it's not my favorite song on the first record, it's one of them. They're sitting around going, what are we doing? This song is just dead. It does nothing. It's literally floating down the Mississippi River, bloated, and it's got some, fish and some birds feeding off it. This thing does nothing. This is an abomination. If this wasn't the point that got Troy Tate fired, it definitely should have been. Or perhaps even before this. The next song is, at least on the Troy Tate's tapes, is the song Gene. A song, of course, that was originally released as a B-side to This Charming Man. Now, instrumentally, this version of this song actually has a little bit of life as far as the tempo, but again, it just kind of sounds like a blob. There's no definition. There's no cleanliness. Morrissey sounds like total ass on this recording, quite frankly. He's off time. His voice doesn't sound very good. He sounds disinterested. Again, his voice sounds very shallow and very tinny, just as far as, the production goes. This song, like I said, the tempo of it has some life, and, the performances by the band aren't necessarily, they're not terrible. They're not as good as what would become the finished product of the song Gene, which, Gene has never really been my favorite Smith song, to be honest with you anyway. But the production on this version of it is so tinny and metallic that it makes you feel like you're brushing your teeth with a metal brush. It kind of makes your eyeballs dry up a little bit. Not a big fan of this one. And Morrissey, of all of the tracks that are at least released on this bootleg, I mean, Morrissey, who, even when he's disinterested and out of time, who doesn't love Morrissey's voice? But he just sounds like ass on this song. I don't know what's going through his mind at the time. I can only imagine how frustrating this must have been for the entire band. Of course, this one ends with the song "Handsome Devil." To me, this sounds like, this version of the song almost sounds like a Stray Cats demo. And I say that not really as a compliment. Not that I have anything against the Stray Cats, mind you. I don't. I'm not the hugest fan of all time. But to me, it sounds very much like a Stray Cats demo, except, the Stray Cats would have not been as sloppy sounding as this recording is. Morrissey sounds okay. At least in this version of the song, he sounds like he's trying a little bit. He sounds like he's at least semi-interested in what's going on, trying to be engaged. The production on his voice sucks, but I think that this version of the song isn't like a complete abortion. As far as the songs that are on this collection of the Troy Tate sessions, I think that Handsome Devil is one that I would say is at least semi-passable. Now, Handsome Devil is a song I really love the finished product of. This version of it is, far inferior to what would eventually come out as the finished product. But as far as the versions of these songs on these tapes, I would say that it is, I guess one of the most passable. Now, of course, as I mentioned before, those are the tracks that appear on this particular bootleg. It is called the 1983 Troy Tate Abandoned Sessions. Hard to imagine why they were abandoned, and John Porter was eventually brought in. And of course, as I mentioned at the beginning of this video, the final product, in my opinion, is the greatest debut album of all time. Sometimes it's hard to imagine that the band went from that to what would eventually be released. I have to imagine at least, that when John Porter came in and showed some amount of competence, it must have been so inspiring to the band. And perhaps he was somebody who was a little bit more pliable when it came to working with Morrissey and the Smiths. Like I said before, this is a band, and especially Morrissey as a frontman has a reputation of being opinionated, being semi-demanding, knowing what they want, knowing how they want to get there. And sometimes I wonder if what happened with Troy Tate was that he perhaps had, too firm of a grip on the production style, or maybe perhaps it wasn't necessarily all his fault. Perhaps there were so many ideas flying around because this was the band's first shot at a full-length studio album that, a lot of the ideas and stuff just kind of got watered down and muddied. I don't really know what the reasoning was. All I can tell you is that those Troy Tate recordings are nothing nice, my friend. Now, if you'd like to check them out for yourselves and you don't have a copy of any of the bootlegs that have been released of them over the years, you can find all of them, I believe, actually on YouTube. I know you can find them other places online. If I haven't sold it to you enough already, you should be sure to go out and check them out. Like I said, I love the fact that these are available. Now, I don't go back and listen to these recordings very often because they just aren't really that enjoyable to me. I don't find them musically to be very good. Like I said, to me, these are archive pieces. These are historical documents. They are a very important part of the story of the first Smiths studio album, which I will say again is the greatest debut album of all time. But I don't particularly get a lot of enjoyment going back and listening to them. Now, I'm not somebody either who, as much as I do enjoy listening to demos periodically, I'm not one of those people who goes back and really nerds out on demos all the time. I've always been somebody who has preferred the finished studio recordings. But I do believe that these Troy Tate tapes and these sessions are important historical documents. So I would recommend go back and listen to them. Judge for yourself. Maybe I'm being a little bit too harsh. I feel as if I am coming down with the lead hammer on Mr. Troy Tate when it comes to these recordings. But in fairness, and I think I mentioned this, hopefully I mentioned it enough. I mean, the band's performances were nothing to be overly proud of either, and neither was a lot of Morrissey's vocal performances. A lot of times he seemed to be out of time. He was disinterested. A couple of times you could almost feel his attitude coming through the recordings, which I guess is understandable if you're not getting what you want as an artist. Anyway, man, thank you so much for checking out this video. This is Archaic Records. My name is Jamie, coming at you from Nashville, Tennessee. Be sure to go out and support your local record store. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to check back every week for Morrissey Monday, a weekly celebration of all things Morrissey and the Smiths, as well as other record content and album reviews throughout the week. And until next time, my friends, talk to you then.